Happy New Year everyone, and welcome back to the channel after 2 weeks away. Today's topic is going to be different to the topics you are used to on this channel, as to kick off 2025 with a bang, we are going to be talking about video games. Don't worry, it's still motorsport related, even if it's in the virtual world. So for anyone who hasn't come across any of my previous channels before, or even my league racing channel which is in the description below, I do like to play video games from time to time, specifically ones that involve racing. Mainly, I play on a game called Gran Turismo 7, or GT7 for short, and I mainly do league racing on there with people I get on with very well and have a very good laugh with. Admittedly, GT7 does have its problems, especially when it comes to the speed of their free updates along with the lack of content you get from it, but apart from that, it is overall a very fun game to drive, and the amount of creative things you can do on there is off the scale. However, before I was mainly doing league racing on Gran Turismo, I was mainly doing league racing on the F1 games, but at the time of recording, the last F1 game I ever played was F1 2020, which in my opinion is the last great F1 game to be released and is still being played to this very day, especially with a massive mod that got released for the game called the Ultimate Career Mode, created by a German modder called Gekai, who is now in the process of creating his own video game called Formula Circus. In fact, the last F1 game I ever got was F1 2021, and that is still to this day in its plastic wrap, as I honestly can't be bothered to touch it. Now the reason why that game has essentially been left in my wardrobe gathering dust is because I became very dejected with the game, especially with the news that came out at the end of 2020 that Codemasters, the company that develops the F1 games, had been purchased by EA Sports, a company who has previous history with publishing F1 games, most notably F1 Challenge 99-02, and a company who are mainly known for publishing sports titles such as FIFA, nowadays known as EAFC, and of course the Madden series. When this news broke, I became fearful that given EA's history with certain games, not just with sports games, but also other games that are under the EA banner, that the game would end up declining due to poor business decisions on EA's part, as well as a load of bugs and glitches that would ruin the experience for people playing the game. And as I sit here right now in January 2025, it's safe to say that I was sadly right, and it has now gotten to a point where sales for the game are at an all-time low. So for this video, I thought I would go through the reasons why the F1 game is currently going through a rut at the moment, and why I genuinely fear that this year's game could end up being make or break for both Codemasters and EA. This is the current state of the F1 games. So let's go back to when Codemasters first got the rights to the F1 game. In November 2006, the PlayStation 3 was released to both the Japanese and North American market and would get sporadically released to other countries and continents in the months afterwards, or in some cases like in Indonesia and Brazil, years afterwards. A month after both Japan and North America got hold of the PS3, Studio Liverpool, based in Liverpool, would release the first F1 game on the 7th generation of console, known as F1 Championship Edition, which was essentially a PS3 remake of Formula 106, which was released exclusively on the PlayStation 2 in the summer of 2006. Like its PS2 counterpart, the game was only a PS3 exclusive title, due to Studio Liverpool being owned by Sony, the creators of PlayStation, which meant that it was not released on either the Xbox 360, which came out a few months before the PS3, or even on PC, which hadn't had an F1 game since 2003 after EA had lost the rights to publish F1 games due to Studio Liverpool gaining exclusive rights to the F1 franchise. Studio Liverpool, like with the PS3, would release the game sporadically in the months afterwards to different continents. However, due to all of their effort being put on F1 Championship Edition, it meant that the planned development of Formula 107 had to be cancelled due to a lack of time. Then, in May 2008, and with Studio Liverpool suffering from financial issues, which eventually led to the company's closure in 2012, it was announced that Codemasters had won the right to develop the F1 games and would release the game across multiple platforms rather than being exclusive on one console. However, due to the timing of their announcement, it meant there was not enough time to develop the 2008 game before the year came to an end, meaning F1 fans had to wait another year before a new Formula 1 game was available on shelves. Then, eventually, between November and December of 2009, Codemasters released their first F1 game called F1 2009, and it became the first F1 game since EA's F1 2002 to be released across multiple platforms, with the game being on the Nintendo Wii, PlayStation Portable and iOS. Yeah, so you made the entire fanbase wait 2 years for an F1 game based on the current season, and this is what you give them? Now, to be fair, to cut Codemasters some slack, although the game was published by them, it wasn't actually created by them, as Sumo Digital, based in Sheffield, and known for creating the Sonic and Sega All-Stars racing game, which came out a few months after F1 2009, were tasked with creating the game, which would act as a bit of a stopgap before Codemasters released their first proper F1 game in 2010. What Sumo Digital ended up creating was essentially an arcade game based on the 2009 season, and this would end up being very apparent by the game's floaty steering physics. But nevertheless, even with the mixed reviews the game got, the public finally got an F1 game after 2 years of waiting, and luckily for them, they wouldn't have to wait too long for the next installment, which would turn out to be an absolute hit. In September 2010, Codemasters would release F1 2010 for the Xbox 360, PS3 and the PC, and also iOS devices, but they are irrelevant. The game would be the first to be developed by Codemasters themselves, and it would prove to be a huge success, with the game immersing players into the world of F1 thanks to its unique main menu screen, which saw it integrated into the F1 paddock rather than the bog standard selection screen like on most video games. This immersion would continue into the career mode, where along with having a personal assistant who would take care of your contracts, the game would also have an interview pen, as well as the fleshed out press conference if you won a race, although sadly not if you finished second or third. And if that wasn't enough in terms of immersion, the game would have the player start out in the garage when booting up a session, something that hadn't been seen since Jeff Crammond's Grand Prix 4, which was released back in 2002 and is still being modded to this very day. In terms of the actual gameplay itself, the graphics and steering were a massive step up compared to F1 2009, thanks in large to the self-developed Ego 1.0 engine, as well as the wet weather being highly praised for the way it looked on the track, as well as with how the water would disperse as the race would progress, especially if the conditions were starting to improve. Granted, it did have its issues, with online only allowing up to 12 players in a lobby, the curves often throwing the player into a spin whenever they were hit, and also the penalty system at times being harsh. But apart from that, it was a very enjoyable game to play, with many regarding it as the best F1 game that Codemasters ever launched. A year later, and Codemasters would release F1 2011, launching it on the same platforms as F1 2010, along with also releasing it on the Nintendo 3DS and PlayStation Vita, both of which co-produced by the same company that developed F1 2009, Sumo Digital. Fun fact, and I only found out about this while doing my research for this video, but Sumo Digital also have a studio based in Nottingham that opened in 2016. I guess you learn something new every day. The game, whilst graphically better, along with fixing the curb issue that plagued F1 2010, wasn't as well received as its predecessor, as although the game would increase its online lobby capacity to 16 players, along with introducing the safety car and red flags, the game was heavily criticised for its penalty system once again, with it being way too harsh at certain corners, as well as the physics feeling more unnatural when going around corners, as thanks to the car having a sharper front end, it meant that in most corners you could take it flat out without barely needing to use the brake, which meant that lap times were often unrealistic. F1 2012, which came out a year later, would aim to try and address these issues, which it would do for the most part, but it was around this point between 2012 and 2013 that the quality of the game started to dip, as although gameplay wise it was still fun, there were things within the game that were starting to get cut back, such as the main menu screen, which shifted away from the paddock to a bog standard selection screen, which ended up taking away some of the immersion, along with Grand Prix mode being removed for no reason at all. F1 2013 would bring this feature back, along with adding classic cars and tracks to the game, something that was heavily requested by the F1 gaming community, which was starting to become more prominent around this time, but there were still things that were being cut back, especially with the career mode, which had already started to become stale thanks to a lack of paddock immersion, but it became even more stale when in-game team and car progression, which the game was doing automatically depending on certain factors, was completely dropped for no reason, which ended up making the career mode, which lasted 5 seasons, feel very repetitive as the seasons went by. The online would start to take a dip as well, with persistent bugs such as the lag bubble from F1 2012 and the constant lagging issues on F1 2013, along with the side pod glitch, making it difficult to go wheel to wheel with someone. Then came F1 2014, and by far the worst game to come out from Codemasters. The game was essentially a copy and paste of F1 2013, albeit with 2014 cars, which would often flicker at certain points, 2014 physics which were completely botched, and V6 engines which sounded like a vacuum cleaner. And just like the previous games, there were things that were cut out for unknown reasons, such as classic content, which had only been introduced in F1 2013, and also the Young Drivers Test, which was introduced in F1 2012, but was dropped from 2014, and was instead replaced by a pointless one-lap race, which would eventually give you the option of choosing any team from Season 1, making the career mode go from being repetitive to pretty much pointless to play. The online wasn't any better either, with the issues that persisted on F1 2013 continuing over into F1 2014, combined with the fact that the game was heavily biased towards the controller, with wheel users being at a disadvantage when it came to league racing, given the extra traction that pad users had when coming out of corners. It didn't help either that the game was still being released on the 7th generation of consoles, as by that point both the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 had already been released to the public, which as a result ended up having an impact on F1 2014 sales figures. Also around this time, there appeared to be a huge disconnect between the developers and the fanbase, with features that fans were wanting in the game not being implemented for unknown reasons. There also appeared to be signs that the developers were cutting corners and were often lazy when it came to developing the game, as proved by the fact that for whatever reason, despite it being a new rule in F1 at the time, that the players were not given the option of having their own number on the car, being forced to stop with a number that was already placed on the car instead. The negativity surrounding the game became so overwhelming that it led to senior designer Stephen Hood to leave Codemasters after the release of F1 2014, with Lee Mather essentially taking over his role in overseeing the development of F1 2015, which would become the first F1 game to be released on the 8th generation of consoles, and would be the first F1 game since Formula 106 to be released midway into an active F1 season. But the launch of F1 2015, which Codemasters were hoping would bring the franchise back on track, ended up being a disaster. When gameplay for F1 2015 was released, there was a lot of hype surrounding the game, given how graphically different it looked compared to the previous games. However, by the time the game was released, which was pushed back a month from its original release date, it was very clear that the game was heavily rushed, with there being a lot of bugs and glitches that hampered the presentation of the game, as well as online being practically broken and unplayable upon release, which ended up having a big effect on league racing. And although it would end up getting fixed after a few in-game patches, it was already too late to win back consumers who had moved on to playing other games. It didn't help either that, like with many other games that had their first release on the 8th generation of consoles, that a lot of features were cut out of the game, with the most notable being career mode, which was cut from the game for unknown reasons and replaced by a bog standard championship mode, where the player would do one complete season as one of the 20 drivers that competed in the 2015 season, or as one of the 22 drivers from the 2014 season, as 2014 content was also made available in the game as sort of an apology note for F1 2014 being a shambles, although not a great apology given how bad F1 2015 turned out to be. Despite its issues though, there were signs of potential within the game, as one of its praises, along with the graphics, was the improved AI, as they were now a lot more raceable, which meant that you could have a proper battle with them compared to the previous games where it was a lot easier to overtake and defend them. With this in mind, there was hope that F1 2016 would end up being a fantastic game, and my word did it deliver. The game would end up being released on the 19th of August 2016, and it was a massive step forward compared to F1 2015, with career mode making its welcome return, with it also bringing back some kind of immersion, with the career mode being set inside a team's motorhome. Although the issue of every team being made available still persisted, it was able to ensure the gameplay wasn't repetitive by introducing car upgrades, which enabled the team that was often lower down the order to have a chance of progressing through the pecking order and become a very competitive team. It also, for the first time, allowed the player to choose its own number, provided that it wasn't taken by any of the 22 drivers that competed in the 2016 season, with there also being an opportunity for the player to use the number 1 should they end up winning the title come the end of a season. Online was also a massive improvement compared to F1 2015, with lobbies expanding from 16 to 22 and also the online connection being a lot more stable compared to the previous titles, until it was ruined after a certain patch. F1 2017 would build on the foundation of F1 2016, improving on the R&D upgrades, which often on the previous game reached its peak after a few seasons, and also added regulation changes in order to shake up the order every once in a while. The game would also reintroduce classic cars, which unlike F1 2013, where they were treated as a separate game mode that barely got touched, this time around they would actually have some purpose, as they were integrated into the career mode, with players having an option of attending a classic car meet, giving the players a chance to drive around in a classic F1 car, although after a couple of months this feature would barely get touched. More improvements would come in the games afterwards, with F1 2018 finally adding ERS management, whilst F1 2019 would finally add Formula 2 to the rostrum, as well as implementing driver transfers, which finally saw the AI have the ability of swapping teams after a season had concluded, or in some cases, swapping midway through a season. Then in F1 2020, the game would introduce its biggest feature yet, as the game would finally allow the player the ability to create their own team and compete alongside the 10 teams that were already competing in F1 at the time. With the game boosting in popularity, thanks in large to lockdown increasing its sales figures, as well as the game being fun to play, it looked like the game was finally in a healthy place. However, Codemasters would end up making a decision in late 2020 that would end up seeing the game decline in popularity. On the 14th of December 2020, it was announced that Electronic Arts had purchased Codemasters for a whopping $1.2 billion, outbidding Take-Two Interactive, who were also interested in purchasing the company. This already sent worrying alarm bells in the F1 gaming community, as given EA's track record with other existing titles, there was a genuine fear that EA would end up ruining the F1 game. Luckily for the community, this wouldn't have too much bearing on F1 2021, as although EA's logo would end up on the box cover, as well as them also publishing the game on Codemasters' behalf, the game had already essentially finished development before EA could get their hands on it, as EA had only finished completing their takeover of Codemasters in February of 2021, 5 months before the game was released. Although sales figures would slightly drop compared to F1 2020, along with the game removing classic content once again, F1 2021 was still a well received game, even if it did have its issues when it came to pad users. However, by the time the next game came out, which was renamed F1 22 to fall in line with every other sports game title EA had the rights to, people's fears of what EA were capable of would start to come true, as the game would end up implementing a new game mode that would end up frustrating players in the games afterwards, and that game mode would be known as F1 Life. F1 Life was essentially EA's attempt at creating an F1 version of Ultimate Team, albeit without actually creating a team. For F1 22, which was essentially a beta version of what was to come in F1 23, the game gave the players the ability to essentially create their own living space, essentially implementing The Sims onto an F1 game. I mean, the resemblance of both games is off the scale. No, I'm being serious by the way, I'm not being sarcastic. The feature, like the DFS sale, would end up becoming a meme within the F1 gaming community, with it feeling like a gimmick rather than an actual feature, not helped as well by the introduction of supercars, which would end up playing a similar role to what the classic cars did in career mode. For however funny this game mode ended up being, it wouldn't end up being the game's biggest criticism, as that came in the form of the game's car physics, as thanks to the game implementing a new traction system in response to the new regulations that were brought in 2022, the car for whatever reason would often wheel spin whenever it was in 5th gear, making the car very unstable when coming out of corners, which often put the player at a disadvantage compared to the AI, who acted completely superhuman in this area. This issue would thankfully be fixed for F1 23, thanks in large to the game having a different development team compared to F1 22. However, the game was still heavily criticised, thanks in large to the F1 Life feature once again, this time renamed as F1 World. F1 World expanded on what F1 Life did in F1 22, as along with the player still having its own living quarters, this time integrated into the online menu screen, the feature would give players the chance to develop their own car and compete against other players from around the world, with the feature also allowing the player to upgrade their facilities as well as improve and upgrade their personnel. Now, whilst these features may not sound bad on paper, it was heavily criticised by the fanbase, as many believed that the resources that was put into this game mode should have been put towards the career mode and My Team, as for the last couple of games, both of these game modes had become quite stale. Just like with F1 2014, it felt there was once again a disconnect between the developers and the fanbase, and this was reflected in the game's sales figures. And then when F1 24 was released, although it saw a large improvement on the driver career mode, with this improvement expected to carry over into My Team on F1 25, the game still received a lot of backlash, thanks in large to the car physics once again, as although this area was improved upon on F1 23, the physics took a step backwards in F1 24, thanks in large to David Greco, who was the game's physics developer, leaving the company after the release of F1 23. The physics became more arcadey compared to the previous titles, with the steering feeling a lot more sharper on the front end, like it was on a railway track, as well as the car being very unpredictable when coming out of corners. It also didn't help that the game was riddled with a lot of game-breaking bugs upon release, with the AI racing on dry tyres on a wet track, the race results being wrong on the results screen whenever the race was interrupted by a red flag, which was brought back in F1 23 after it was removed on F1 2015, the carcass temperature of the tyres being too high for the player to control, as well as a graphical glitch with a racer's flag on the R&D chart, clearly showing that the layout had been copied and pasted from F1 23 and clearly not taking into account the extra race F1 24 had compared to F1 23. On top of this, there is also a massive issue with online, not so much with lobby stability, but mainly down to the equal car settings, as despite what it says on the tin, the cars aren't actually equal at all, mainly down to certain cars having a longer wheelbase than others, which has led to competitive online league racing having to switch to the official FOM car to ensure that every player has the same equipment. These issues, combined with modding restrictions, which has made it difficult to customise the game on a PC, has led to sales plummeting to an all-time low, and it has led to genuine fear that F1 25 could be make or break for both Codemasters and EA, as given their contract with F1 runs out after next year, there is a fear that if the sales don't pick up in the next game, then EA and Codemasters could end up losing the license, as it has been suggested that Formula 1 are not happy with the sales figures. Now, I'm not saying that this will happen, as it is only a rumour, but what I will say is that if EA and Codemasters do end up losing the license due to them being unable to bring the sales figures up, then I do fear that this could end up affecting the F1 game down the line, as although a change in developer may give the game the kick in the backside it needs, my fear is that there isn't a developer out there that springs to mind that could pick up the license, as any developer that you could think of have already got themselves occupied with another racing project. If EA and Codemasters do end up losing the license, we could end up in a situation like in both 2007 and 2008 where there isn't an F1 game being released during that time, and that could end up having a huge impact on Formula 1, especially when trying to appeal to a younger demographic who are usually interested in playing video games. As we've seen with IndyCar, them not having a video game of their own is making it difficult for them to appeal to a younger audience, and if Codemasters and EA don't pull their finger out, then I do fear the same thing could happen with F1. Now, I doubt anyone from Codemasters or EA will be watching this, and I'm not expecting them to, but if they really do care about the F1 franchise, then they really need to start getting their act together and actually start paying attention to their fan base, otherwise it's going to end up biting them on the arse quite badly. Anyways, that's my say on the F1 franchise. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you next week for the next video. Till then, take care.